Hello everybody. So we've been talking about crime scene investigation and evidence collection. We went through the classification of evidence. So now we're going to talk about what to do at a crime scene. Of course, you've learned some of what not to do by watching the JonBenet Ramsey video, and we'll see more of that with the O.J. Simpson case. So first, let's go over the members of the CSI team and what their roles would be in a crime scene investigation. So first we have the police officers. Generally, they are the first ones to arrive at a crime scene, and they would be the ones to determine whether a crime has even been committed and decide what professionals to call in, and would also do anything else that needs to be done at that time. Look for suspects, victims, and witnesses. Of course, they would be the ones to secure the crime scene. Crime scene investigators would come in and do all of their photography and processing. They would provide a sign-in log, so anyone that entered that crime scene would have to sign in. And they need to be thorough, and they need to do a competent investigation, because that really increases the chance of successful prosecution of the perpetrator. And they need to begin with the end in mind, which would be presenting their evidence in court. So they have to make sure they do everything correctly and with a high degree of ethics and integrity. The medical examiners are also known as coroners, and the medical examiners, of course, would be present at a crime when there's been a death involved, and they would determine whether it's a homicide or not. And the medical examiner would sign the cause of death certificate. They would examine the body at the scene and then also back in the crime lab. The detectives, of course, would be the ones to look for leads in the case, interviewing witnesses and any living victims, and talking to the crime scene investigators about the evidence, which can often give them an idea of which way to go in the investigation. And then you have your specialists, depending on what's going on at the crime scene. Entomologists, which are insect biologists, which would be there, particularly if a dead body's been found that's been there a while, although insects do arrive in minutes. But if the body's been there a while, the entomologist can tell how long based on the life cycle of the insects that are colonizing the body. Not a very pleasant thought, but it's a reality of life or death, as it were, in this case. The other specialists could be forensic psychologists, if it looks like there may be a serial killer, or just to get some insight into the criminal and what their motives might be. And any other specialists, depending on what's going on at the scene. If it's an outdoor area and there's plants around, a forensic botanist or somebody who is a geologist. So it really depends. So these are the 7 S's of CSI. So we're going to go through these. First step is securing the scene. So this would be the responsibility of the first police officer called to the scene or alerted to the scene in some other way. First priority is always safety of anyone who may be present and rendering medical aid if needed to anybody. Second priority is to preserve that crime scene. That means you do not let anybody in that is not supposed to be there. This was the problem in the JonBenet Ramsey case. There were friends all over the house. They were wiping down the counters, destroying who knows what kind of evidence. And the first responding officer would also call for the forensic experts needed. Important fact is any witnesses need to be separated right away. Again, they did not do this in the JonBenet Ramsey case. They should have separated those parents and questioned them separately, because witnesses should not be allowed to engage in collusion, meaning that, they're getting their story straight So they all tell the police the same thing. You don't want that. Next is scanning the scene and determining, is this a primary crime scene or a secondary crime scene? For example, somebody could be murdered at one location, that could be a primary crime scene, and then there could be a body dump and the body is found at another location. It's a secondary crime scene. So a crime scene could be a house with overturned furniture, broken glass, blood all over the place, but no body. So that would be your primary crime scene. And then the secondary crime scene would be wherever the body was found. And depending on what happens, sometimes the secondary crime scene is found first when a body's found, and it may take a while to find the primary crime scene. Seeing the scene, always want to take lots of photos, and you want to take these photos from numerous vantage points. You want to get close-ups, you want to get far away, you want to use a ruler to measure objects, and you want to reference any stationary objects that would be present, so you always know what part of the crime scene you're looking at in the photos. Doing a preliminary sketch on the scene is also important, noting the position of the body and any other important evidence. You want to do measurements from immovable landmarks, label north and the scale of measurement, and include every object at the scene. The sketch would be finalized for court, often using a computer program. So here's an example of a crime scene sketch. So you can see the floor plan here. You can see the key there on the bottom left showing all the different parts, the coffee table, the lamp, the couch, etc. We can see the body. We don't need a key for that, and the gun and cartridge cases, etc. So one thing that's important with searching for evidence is the investigators have to be systematic. So depending on how many investigators you have and the size of the crime scene will depend on which pattern you use. So you can search in a spiral pattern, linear, grid, quadrant pattern, and the point is to make sure that you don't miss anything. Next is securing the evidence and collecting properly. So we use a paper bindle for biological evidence. So basically what that is a piece of paper folded in a certain way, and we will make one in class. And one important piece of evidence, if there's any evidence that's wet, which you may have, like a bloody shirt or any other body fluids on any other piece of fabric, it's got to be dried out before it's placed in the bindle. So it can either be dried out back at the crime lab, and it will need to be transported, and usually they would clip it onto a clothespin and transport it in the crime van and either dry it in there or dry it back in the lab. The bindle then, once it's dried, needs to be placed inside either a plastic or paper bag. And we always have to attach the evidence log and the chain of custody document. Again, very important, wet evidence not be placed directly into the bag while it's still wet, because that can lead to growth of mold or bacteria, and that could actually degrade your DNA, and then it's not usable. So here's an example of an evidence recovery log. So you would have to make sure that this is properly filled out and that every piece of evidence that you collect makes it onto this log, because if it doesn't, then it will be inadmissible in court. And if that's your smoking gun, so to speak, that's a big problem. Another important, very important thing is the chain of custody. Chain of custody is a list of everybody who handled that piece of evidence, and it's right on the evidence bag. So you can see there on the bag the list of chain of custody, all the names of the people who handled that bag, and they would put the date and time when they handled it. Of evidence will seal the bag and then sign their name across the seal. The next person that handles that evidence will open up the bag in a different spot, leaving the original seal, and will work with the evidence, reseal the bag, and then put on another seal and sign their name across the top, and everybody who handles the evidence will do the same thing. And there needs to be documentation as to where that piece of evidence was at every point since it was collected. And if you don't have that, that piece of evidence may not hold up in court. When handling evidence, important points to remember: you need to wear gloves. Each item needs to be in a separate container, seal and label. Be careful with direct sunlight and heat that can degrade evidence, and biological evidence should be refrigerated, and evidence should make it to the lab back to the lab pretty quickly. What you want to have ideally is somebody who's working on the scene to deliver evidence as it's being collected. And now, of course, they can use mobile phones to take pictures of fingerprints and send them right back. So the processing of the evidence is to determine what happened. So that evidence may corroborate a person's testimony, in other words, support the testimony. Could also refute the testimony, prove that that's not what happened, it's not what the victim or the perpetrator says. It can provide a link between the suspect and the victim, or the suspect and the crime scene. And in the case of biological evidence, it can help establish the identity of the perpetrator. And then, of course, it can also eliminate suspects. And the whole point of investigating a crime is to try and reconstruct the sequence of events. So their job is to piece together, by looking at all of their evidence, piece together the sequence of events leading up to the commission of a crime and through the commission of a crime. And that evidence is compared to statements of witnesses and victims to determine what happened. And one of the things that you want to look for is possibly a staged crime scene. There are cases where the perpetrator stages a fire to cover some other crime, like a murder or a burglary. Sometimes a murder is staged to look like a suicide. And sometimes you might have a situation where a person actually inflicts a wound on themselves, whether it's a gunshot or a stab or something, to make it look like they engaged in a struggle and they were one of the victims when actually they may have been the perpetrator. Sometimes a burglary is staged because people want to collect insurance money. So an experienced crime scene investigator often can walk in and they know what you see at a certain type of crime, and they can walk around and they can just know that something isn't right, and they will investigate from that point on to see if they can figure out what really happened. And that's really the whole point of crime scene investigation, is to determine the facts, what happened. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in class.